Hello, friends. Welcome to Heidi's Colorful Colorado. I'm your host, Heidi Ganal, a wife, mom of four, CU Regent, and the founder of Camp Bow Wow and the She Factor. With a passion for keeping the spirit of our state alive and well, I started this podcast to bring the people of Colorado together to celebrate the amazing state we call home. Come along on this journey with me as I travel across our old country roads in my vintage RV, interviewing folks that embody the true spirit of the Rocky Mountains. From the Front Range to the mile-high city to the wild west of southern Colorado, we'll celebrate the history, beauty, and Coloradans that make this place the colorful state it is. Each week, you'll meet people trailblazing the way for an even more colorful future for us all, making a huge difference along the way. Are you ready for a Rocky Mountain ride? Let's do this, Colorado. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Heidi's Colorful Colorado. Today, we're headed to Boulder, which you can see the views on Roger's screen. Looks amazing. I wish we were there live, but happy to have you today, Roger. So many things to talk about. First, I'll let you go ahead and tell folks a little bit about your background because it's incredibly diverse and interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. It's great to be with you. Here I am flying over Boulder. I came to CU Boulder as a professor in 2001, actually 20 years ago in 2 weeks. And before that, I was a scientist at NCAR here in Boulder, which you can see over my shoulder. And I work on interesting and controversial issues at the intersection of science, policy, and politics, which it seems there's no shortage of these days.
Yeah, that's what we were chatting with a little bit before the Zoom set in. And, lots of hot topics right now. One of the things I saw on Twitter that you're mentioning a lot right now is about the Wuhan lab and what's going on with COVID. And I know you've done a lot of work on COVID. So maybe give us an update on what you've done with COVID, what your work's been about, and where things stand right now.
Yeah, I'm leading a 16-country, 19-case study project. I'm doing a comparative assessment of science advice in the pandemic around the world. Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, we have projects on every continent. And the question we're asking is not how well did countries respond to the pandemic, but how effective was the advice that scientists gave to policymakers. Obviously, policymakers can make good decisions with bad advice or bad decisions with good advice, but we're trying to see how well advice worked. And the nice way to put what we're learning is we're learning a lot of lessons. There's a lot of unanticipated policy shortfalls around the world in the use of advice. Some places did well. South Korea did very well. New Zealand has done very well. North Carolina, a state, one of our case studies, did very well. United States, some real problems. The UK, some real problems. So we have an enormously rich amount of information that we're learning about science in the pandemic.
So what did North Carolina do right? Or what were some of the things that we should do differently if we head into another situation like this?
Yeah, the United States case is really interesting because after the H1N1 scare about a decade ago, that would have been a window of opportunity for the U.S. to become better prepared for future pandemics. Mm-hmm. And when all is said and done, I think one of the lessons that we're going to be drawing out, not just for science advice, but for the pandemic generally, is we missed that opportunity. And we were not, as at the federal level, well prepared for a pandemic. So that puts states, Colorado, North Carolina, every state, school districts, sports leagues, into a position where they had to fend for themselves. And North Carolina has states are much smaller ecosystems than the federal government. And the North Carolina case led by Jessica Winkle, who's a CU PhD, who works at UNC Wilmington, found that because science advisors and the state policymakers had pre-existing relationships, they were able to work together pretty well to get scientific advice to policymakers so that they could make decisions about schools, about universities, about public health recommendations. And so, it's a very rich tapestry when the federal government falls down of experiences across the nation. And North Carolina is just one of those.
So one of the things that's weaved into that is the role of the media and the role of politics. Talk a little bit about that and how we might do better on that front going forward.
Yeah, one of the failings that we're finding in the U.S. case is we lacked an overall capacity for providing scientific guidance at the national level. This is something that a number of places could have done it. CDC, Department of Health and Human Services, National Academy of Sciences. What happens in that situation when there's not overarching, authoritative, legitimate advice is that every state fends for themselves. So Colorado is like North Carolina, is like Idaho. Most states relied on their universities, put together expert advisory committees. And then you have a tapestry of recommendations that are different using the same science. So it's very easy politically for people to pick and choose the science they like. Oh, I like how Alabama's doing it. No, I like how New Hampshire's doing it. And then it becomes very confusing to people when they see very different sorts of recommendations and scientific guidance across the country.
How did Colorado do handling the pandemic overall?
Overall, Colorado did probably in the middle of states. It's very hard to assess right now how well they should have done. Obviously, there's a tremendous loss of life in the United States overall that didn't have to happen. Colorado should be commended for the fact that relying on the CU Anschutz, University of Colorado Boulder faculty, putting together advisory body to advise Governor Polis. And looking at our own university, we had to go, started online, went offline, tried to come back. And there will be, post hoc evaluations as to, what could have and what should have been done. But clearly the fact that different communities, different institutions are in a sense competing with each other, it makes it very difficult to have an overall perspective on what could we have done better as a state, given that the federal level failed so comprehensively.
So how do you coordinate with the business community as you're making decisions and moving forward as scientists? Are you talking to the business research division at CU? And, we're having a tough time climbing back out economically in Colorado, and unemployment rates are flat. We're having a challenge there. How do you guys coordinate your efforts, and who wins those arguments? I assume it's science, but let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. One of the first things I tell my students in my classes on policy is that I don't use the term public policy. What the government does and the decisions that are made at the governmental level are really important, of course, but it's a subset of all policy decisions. And a policy is just a decision. And if we're not comprehensively including both the business sector, but also civil society, as well as government, we're missing a big part of the picture. So as we look at the pandemic, one of the big failures of science advice, and it's not just in the United States, but it's around the world, was to integrate economic considerations with public health considerations. It turns out that most of the science advice was focused on public health, but most of the political debate was over, well, what's the effect on the economy? What are the consequences? And it was left to policymakers to do the really hard task of taking, on the one hand, public health advice, and then economic concerns of citizens and businesses. And it was up to the policymakers to put those together. So we found ourselves, and again, around the world, into this kind of, very extreme debate between lockdown or no lockdown. But the reality is that there was a lot of options that sat in between that could have been taken. And I put that on the failure of the expert community to figure out how to help governments integrate public health and economics.
Yeah, it really did feel like you had to pick one side or the other, which wasn't beneficial for either, right?
Right, exactly.
And so, Roger, you've been, and this leads into another conversation around cancel culture. And that's something that we deal with in higher education every day on lots of different fronts. And you've been actually a victim of cancel culture in some aspects in your career and your work. What do you think about what's going on right now? And how do we address that issue in higher ed, in your classroom, actually?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't think I've been a victim of cancel culture. There's a few people in our society who have the privilege to not be canceled, and a tenured full professor is one of them. People can choose or not to choose to give me a platform, but the reality is, I'm out there on Twitter with tens of thousands of followers. I write for the New York Times and Financial Times, and There was a time in my career when I would have thought that, well, no, 5-year contracts are fine for professors. We don't need tenure. I can tell you over my experiences over the last decade or so, I'm a big supporter of tenure. But I do think we do see a disturbing tendency, and it's within academia as well, to try to silence or shout down or make invisible voices that are inconvenient rather than dealing with them in the public sphere. I'm a big fan of transparency and putting arguments out there, even those that are unwelcome or maybe unpopular, because the best way we all learn is to see that interaction between different groups, and that's part of democracy. So I tell my students, and I'm honest about this. I don't care what exactly they think. They're Republicans, if they're Democrats, if they support this policy, if they support that policy. What I care about is how they think. And there are better and worse ways to come up with arguments and ideas. My job is to teach them how to think, not what to think. So that means if you want to learn how to think, you have to bring uncomfortable, difficult, challenging ideas into the classroom. And I tell my students, my job as a professor is whatever argument you take up in my class, it's a policy class, you might find me taking the opposite side. Not because I believe it, because that's my job, is to subject you to challenge. So I think when academics and scientists engage in trying to silence opposition rather than engaging with them, we're doing a disservice to discourse, but also to the notion of democracy, where we put ideas out there, and over the long term, the better ideas will win.
That's something I've tried hard to work on in my 4 years as a regent, is bringing both sides of an issue to debate. And I was shocked to find out that there really is not a robust debate club at CU anymore. I tried to revive it, and students were just not willing to put themselves out there. Maybe even playing the role of having an opposite position. If they get caught on video and gets put on social media, it goes viral, that's their career that's at stake. So how do we tactically open up people's minds and hearts and voices so that we can hear both sides of an issue, and so that they're not afraid of being shouted down or going viral on social media? And I mean, from a student perspective, because I find the students are really the ones going after the other students. I think the faculty do a pretty good job of keeping an open environment at CU and robust conversation.
Yeah, one thing, and I mean, you've heard this from me before, and this is a long time complaint I have about my own home institution that I love, is that we're the only Pac-12 school that does not have a policy program, policy department, policy school. Most Pac-12 schools have a named, big policy school. If we want to train students to engage in the public sphere, even the complicated public sphere that involves social media and people trying to shout you down or get you fired or whatever, those aren't things you learn on the fly. Those are things that require practice, training, like anything else we teach. And the fact that CU Boulder lacks a policy school, to me, is a big gap, because that is where we would train people, professors, postdocs, grad students, undergrads, to not only do policy analysis, which itself is technical and complicated, but to interact in a world that's highly politicized, full of propaganda, misinformation, sometimes bad will. That's just the world we live in. And we have an obligation as a major university to provide that training, and we're not. So it's my view that, a debate club is interesting and good, but, the challenge is that most issues have more than two sides. Mm-hmm. And if we start out by saying there's two sides, we've already missed what's really important in policy, which is, hey, can we find that third way where we can get Republicans and Democrats together, maybe not on the big issue, but maybe on smaller issues, and make things work. So that institutional hole in our campus is one that I think I'd love to see filled before the end of my career.
Well, maybe I can help out with that. I know we've talked a lot about that, but
Right.
I've got a couple of years left, so we could push.
Right.
That's another conversation. One of the hot topics in higher ed and at CU is diversity and equity. And, all of us want to solve for that problem. We really want a robust, diverse, like we're talking about, viewpoint diversity, racial diversity, geographic diversity. And, we haven't moved the needle in how many years? You sent me some good data on that a while ago. We haven't moved the needle. We've spent millions and millions of dollars on trying to solve for this problem. And one of my frustrations is you can't manage what you don't measure. And there's been a real lack of accountability on the money that we're spending and what we're spending it on and what the return on investment for those dollars is. And I really think we need some transparency into that to solve the problem. And I know President Kennedy's worked hard to try and figure out a plan, a go forward plan. What do you think of that plan? And is there anything missing, or what do you like or don't like about that?
Yeah, this past semester, I had the good fortune in my graduate seminar, which is focused on science and technology broadly, which includes higher education, to have my seminar focused on diversity at CU Boulder as a policy problem. And what we did is we first defined, well, what's the problem? And then we talked about, well, what are some certain interventions that might make a difference? And you're right, when we look at the indicators and the indicators that the university itself says are important in terms of diversity, whether it's head counts from different groups, or it's retention rates, or it's GPA, the university hasn't really moved the needle in over a decade, which is, I think, a strong statement about how effective the past policies have been. I've come to the conclusion that one of the biggest obstacles, and again, it's complicated. There's staff, there's faculty, there's grad students and undergrads, but at the undergrad level, let me just say a huge obstacle is what's called admissions management. And the simple fact is, and Colorado's not alone here, state governments over the last 20 years plus have pulled back from funding universities. Universities have filled that gap with tuition money, and mainly tuition money from out-of-state students who pay higher rates. And we've seen at University of Colorado Boulder ever increasing proportions of out-of-state students. We even have some fun statistical games where some in-state students count as two people, which allow us to increase the number of out-of-state students. We're focused on revenue, and we need revenue to make the university go. But if we focus on out-of-state students with the ability to pay full freight to come to the University of Colorado, we will be selecting from a socioeconomic class that's less diverse than the nation as a whole or Colorado as a whole. And again, you see this at Michigan, you see this at Virginia, you see this at big state universities. We have the unfortunate standing of having the most students from families in the top 1% of income in the United States. That's a consequence of our budget model. And our budget model goes back to the Douglas Bruce Amendment and so on. There's a lot of complexities involving state politics. But if we truly want to become a more diverse university at the undergraduate level, we need to figure out a way to diversify our revenue streams, but also a way to select students based purely on excellence, including diversity, and not just ability to pay, plus excellence. I had the good fortune to spend about 4 or 5 years in our athletic department at CU Boulder, working to build an academic unit. And one of the questions I always had was, well, why is our athletic department diverse? Why does it look like Colorado or the United States and the rest of the campus doesn't? And the simple answer is they don't have to worry about money. They can go anywhere they want and pick the most excellent athlete and bring them here. If we could do that on the academic side, right away we'd have the potential for a much more diverse campus. But right now we do have to worry about money. And as long as that's the case, it will be very hard to achieve diversity goals.
You talk about athletics at CU, and there are some leaders in the university system and on the region board that are not big fans of athletics, and it is one of the most diverse departments at CU. And I think the student athletes are amazing. I mean, they are such good role models, and Rick George has done a wonderful job at bringing great people into our university on the student level and the team there. How does that jive? Like, how do you talk about that from the perspective of bringing diversity to the larger community at CU from the athletics, what's worked in the athletics department?
Yeah, I mean, the big problem for athletics, and I agree. I mean, I like Rick. He's done a great job as a leader, but Rick and all the good people in CU athletics are working in a broken system. The NCAA and college athletics as a whole is just a broken system. The straight talk reality is that college athletes, for the most part, are exploited. And they do get compensated, but that compensation is not like their coaches or their athletic directors. It's not at a market rate. And so that's changing rapidly. It's going to be a very different world. There's a Supreme Court case that's going to report out here pretty soon. College athletics will look very different. One of the things I learned when I was in the athletic department, which I had a sense of, but really didn't fully understand, is that if you're a college athlete, you don't have access to the entire spectrum of degrees on our campus because of your practice times, because of the hours you have to put in. And so, yes, college athletes get a degree, but they get a reduced form, kind of pseudo college experience as compared to most other students. So to the degree that we can fairly compensate athletes, and in the United States, fair compensation is, people like to think of the quote unquote free market. And if government's in there limiting what you could be paid, or where you can go to school, most people think that, well, that's kind of un-American. But it's interesting that college athletics is probably the most socialist institution that you'll find in the United States. And it's interesting, the political dynamics on either side of who loves that socialist organization and who doesn't.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I mean, I'll be curious to see what happens with the Supreme Court case. When are they looking at that? Do they know yet?
They've already heard the case, and they're going to report out probably over the summer. And depending on how they come out, it could change the landscape of college athletics forever. So it's a very interesting time. And the good news is that the trend has been towards opening things up, better supporting the athletes. I mean, one reason why the compensation of coaches is going up and up across the 50 states, something like 45 states, the highest paid public official is a coach, basketball or a football coach, is because those resources have nowhere to go. And they have again, it's a cartel, it's a closed system. And if you only have 65 of the Power 5 football coaches, and it's not expanding, then if the revenues go up, of course, everyone's going to be making $10 million a year. And so the case for not sharing that with the athletes who actually do the work has become weaker and weaker over time. Interesting.
One last topic, and we've traveled the gamut, right?
Right.
Like natural disasters and climate change, and you've done a lot of work in that area. And I saw on your Twitter, you've been having some of those conversations more recently. Tell us a little bit about what's going on there and what you're highlighting right now.
Yeah, so with some colleagues, Matt Burgess in particular at CU Boulder, who's an assistant professor in environmental studies, we've been looking at scenarios of the future. And scenarios are plausible, possible futures where the world might be headed. And there's some really good news to report. Maybe 15 years ago, there was a view that there were some scenarios of kind of massive emissions, enormous climate changes in the future. And it seems that those scenarios are now off the table. Yes, climate change is real and it does pose a problem, but the world is contrary to what you might read in the newspapers, the world is well positioned and heading in the right direction. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that maybe not by 2050, but certainly in the second half of this century, we're going to hit net zero carbon dioxide. And climate change is going to go from what people today call an existential crisis to more of a nuisance, and something that we feel like we've well managed. The best comparison is there was concern in the 1960s and 70s about overpopulation. And the world took note. We put a lot of money into agriculture. The Green Revolution led to the production of more food. As women became more educated and wealthier, they had less children. And today you don't hear people talking about overpopulation, but we have 4 billion more people on the planet than we did in 1970 when we had these concerns. So I think a good model for the future trajectory of climate change as a policy issue will be much like population from the 60s and 70s. Yes, it's real. Yes, it's a concern. But we're pretty inventive, we're smart, and we're moving in the right direction. And I know that this is a topic where optimism and positivity is not always welcomed, but it's a message I keep putting out there. And the world has a lot of work to do, but we're moving in the right direction.
Well, thanks, Roger. This has been fascinating, and I think you have one of the most interesting Twitter feeds in the state. You get great conversations. How else can people follow your work and what you're up to at CU?
Yeah, I have a Substack blog, which is the new thing for writing newsletters, which people can sign up to. They can follow me on Twitter. I'm readily accessible. As a public university professor, I welcome anybody in the state emailing me anytime. I'm happy to send my papers or respond as much as I can. I really think transparency is really important for us faculty members. As I said, we're really privileged in the job that we have. So being out there and open and is essential. So people shouldn't hesitate to be in touch.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being so open and brave to talk about your perspectives and your take on things with in a bold manner. I think we need to applaud that, whether we agree with you or not. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? And
yeah.
Oh, go
well,
ahead.
Let me thank you, Heidi, for your leadership on the Board of Regents, and I know you've been a long time commitment to improving diversity and openness and different perspectives, and that's really valued from the faculty perspective.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll keep working hard, and we'll have a conversation offshoot about the public policy department at CU and how we get
that. Let's do that.
We've got a few things going on there right now, but we can put it on the agenda. Well, thank you, Roger. Have a great day. And I thank you also for the views of the Flat Irons to start my day off. There's no more beautiful place on the planet in my eyes. So
agreed. Have a great day, Heidi.
Thank you for joining us today on Heidi's Colorful Colorado. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And definitely follow me on Instagram to keep up with my latest adventures. In the meantime, happy trails from me, Heidi Ganahl.